I'm John Lewis, and you're listening to 360 Degree City, a podcast where we're talking to people who are working to make their cities better. Our hope is that after the end of each episode, you'll start to see your own city from a slightly different angle. 360 Degree City is brought to you by the team at Intelligent Futures. We're a group of versatile urban problem solvers, and our aim is to find better ways of living together. This past week, we had the pleasure of attending the 100th annual Canadian Institute of Planners Conference in Ottawa. We were really grateful to actually win 3 awards. Our engagement lead, Cassandra Cager, received the President's Award for Young Planners, recognizing her outstanding contribution to planning in Canada. Our Ephemeral and Intermittent Streams project received an Award of Excellence in the Planning Practice category, and this very podcast received an Award of Excellence in the Media and Publications category. Not bad for a team of 6, if I do say so myself. While this has been amazing to receive this national recognition for our efforts, I think it also reflects what's been happening inside our shop. Over the last few years in particular, we've been really intentional about building our culture at Intelligent Futures. At the center of our day-to-day working lives are our core values. We have 3. The first is stay curious. Our firm is a place where we're constantly pushing each other to learn more about the world and how we can improve our impact. The second is always strive for amazing work. The work of Intelligent Futures is focused on making a positive impact in the world. And the final one is take courageous action. So we aim to be a company that thrives by taking action in places and in ways that others won't. And reflecting on these awards, our values were foundational to all of these initiatives. And from quite a different lens, today's episode is also about values and culture.
Something that's really amazing and beautiful about the festival world that I think is what continues to draw people to it is the things that we really practice and celebrate within a festival site are kind of what we would like to see in our society in a bigger way.
But not about office culture. Rather, I'm talking to Gillian Moranz about music festival culture and the values that people often hold at these types of events.
My name is Gillian Moranz, and I work in event coordination, specifically in terms of live music and live music festivals.
In this episode, Gillian and I talk about where she grew up, her undergraduate thesis that took her to music festivals from Vancouver Island to Newfoundland, and how cultural elements of community, intention, and value are conducted at different music festivals across the country. So let's dive in. So I wanted to go fairly far back in terms of maybe you could tell us a bit about where you grew up and how that impacted your research and your university days and the work that you do today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in southern Alberta, which is a tiny little town just south of Calgary. It's actually where Joni Mitchell was born. Lots of people don't know that because she actually grew up in Saskatoon, but that's where she started out as a very, very tiny little baby. Fort Macleod.
Fort Macleod. Okay, right.
Yeah. It's at the junction of the Highway 2 and the Highway 3.
Mm-hmm.
And so growing up there was very interesting. It's a very small town. Very much like many small towns in southern Alberta, quite conservative, quite just kind of set in its ways in terms of its history. And there wasn't a lot going on. So as a young kid, it was very easy to kind of feel bored and a little bit disenfranchised. You know, that sort of alienation that we feel in our hometowns as young people who are turning into adolescents and going through all of those phases. But there wasn't much to do, but there was something that my parents had helped create, which was this little music festival called South Country Fair, which is still 33 years later, still happening today.
Mm-hmm.
So that was definitely a really big part of where I grew up. I didn't see arts and culture in terms of really having a wide breadth of exposure to different types of arts and culture and artistic expression. That wasn't really something that was just a given in the town that I grew up in. So I learned very early on the value of having those types of experiences because they weren't always accessible. And so that was definitely something that informed as I grew up and I became an adult with a little bit more agency in what I was going to do with my time and where I was going to spend my time, that was definitely something that informed all of those next phases and chapters in my life, was not taking for granted the arts and culture that you can encounter, and really starting to dig into why it's so important. And so it was definitely a really big part of growing up and not always having those opportunities. Definitely made my my search for that stronger.
Mm-hmm. And so with that background, what are your insights in terms of why live music, why arts and culture? What do you think that brings to a city or a community?
I think it's a lot of things. I mean, it's a huge part of our cultural fabric. And it's a huge part of our cultural fabric that's kind of naturalized a little bit. There's a lot of the time we don't always necessarily think about what it takes to put a band together, to rehearse that band, to write the songs, or to learn the songs that you're performing, and then to have that be something that people can encounter. There's a lot that goes into actually putting that in motion. But it's something that is very much naturalized in our society as well. But I think in terms of importance, it's highly accessible. It actually is in many ways samples of our oral history as well. You can look back through the ages and through the decades, and there's definitely songs or sounds or genres that are going to be more prominent in different times of sort of that musical trajectory. But also it's a really big vehicle for social and political change and messages. And I think that having that space where it is simultaneously so accessible and also something that is kind of naturalized gives it this really, really potent power that is, I don't know if you saw the documentary with about Sam Cooke. It's on Netflix right now.
No, I haven't.
But it's really, really great. I would recommend it to absolutely anyone. It's really important for a lot of reasons as well. But in the 60s, Sam Cooke was he was a huge civil rights advocate and an activist. And, he was put in this kind of the same categories as Dr. King, as Malcolm X, as Muhammad Ali, just in terms of the type of activism that he was, and the kind of rights that he was advocating for. But Sam Cooke was kind of considered to be more dangerous in a specific way than Dr. King or Malcolm X by the people who were trying to oppress this movement, because he had a direct avenue into the living rooms of white America, because his music was so accessible. And it was packaged in a way that wasn't just an activist standing in front of an audience of activists wanting to spread that message. It was packaged in a way that was so accessible that it could circulate in a way that was not just sort of preaching to the choir or trying to convert. It actually kind of got underneath people's skin and did something without them really knowing it. And that was part of the reason why it's so important for everyone to see that film and to understand the story of Sam Cooke, but also it's a really good example on why music can be so important in terms of a city landscape, because there's so many different dimensions to what it can do as a vehicle for activism, for social change, and also just for sort of recording where our society is at that exact moment. I think that it's indispensable, really.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's really insightful, and it makes me think of in terms of the city building and the actual physical pieces of our cities. Those are also artifacts in time. So it's an interesting parallel in terms of, certain styles of architecture, certain kinds of infrastructure, all those kinds of things. Those you can go through a city and almost walk through time in certain ways because those are markers of those places and what was represented there. So that's a really interesting parallel I'd never thought of in terms of being able, like the cultural markers, the physical markers of how our society and our communities evolve over time. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really cool too, when you look at the histories of cities in terms of, like right now I'm living in Vancouver, and Vancouver was, aside from maybe Montreal, it was the punk rock mecca of Canada in the 80s. Like, it was, the punk scene here was unmatched. And even though the music landscape has changed a lot, in the last 40 years, it still is such an undercurrent of the music landscape here. Even though it might not be exactly the same as it was, it's still something that you see all of those artifacts from, that are still very much informing what the landscape looks like today. So yeah, it is. Those parallels are very interesting.
Yeah, and I was last year. I was just in Cleveland, and of course had to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they actually have a whole section that's dedicated to cities and particular styles and movements in music, whether it's New York, Manchester, etc. So yeah, those ties are a lot more tightly wound than probably a lot of us think of on a day-to-day basis. But as a music curator, it's probably more front of mind for you than most.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to, and I feel very fortunate to get to explore that in the way that I do as well.
So maybe if we could go back a few years now, I know, but I just want to chat with you about your thesis that you wrote in university about the anthropological analysis of Canadian festival spaces. Perhaps you could share some of the most interesting things you learned in writing that thesis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like any good research project, when I got to the end of it, and it was about 4 years altogether. When I got to the end of it, I would happily do the whole thing over again, because I knew exactly what I would do differently, which was a lot of things. But that's the nature of learning, right? And that's how you know that you've really pushed yourself, and you've accomplished something in that learning experience. But yeah, essentially, I mean, I grew up with festivals. Like my parents were two of the founding members of South Country Fair back in the 80s. And it was, as I was saying, when I was explaining the place that I grew up, it was always something that was very special to me. But I didn't fully recognize how fortunate I was to have that relationship with a festival like that until I was in university, when I kind of started to learn things that were causing me to put names and terminology and history and background onto the things that I had just sort of understood as just sort of a given in the festival world. So I got very, very interested and very fascinated just in what the different elements, the analytical elements of those events were. And because festivals it's such a broad term, there's so many kinds of festivals. There's so many kinds of music festivals. There's so many different intentions, from sort of grassroots, organically constructed events to kind of the more corporate side of things, and everything in between. It's such a vast, very interesting landscape. So I started to get really interested in it, and I was studying cultural anthropology, and I was very fortunate to go to, I was studying at the University of Lethbridge, and it is very much a liberal arts school. They give you a lot of opportunity to really self-direct your education. And so I decided I wanted to do an independent study on Western Canadian festivals, and just kind of, I didn't really have like a thesis at that point. I was just really interested on what people considered valuable in those spaces. And so I went to 9 different festivals in Western Canada. This was in 2011. And at the University of Lethbridge also funded my research, which was amazing, because I was able to do this as a summer job without having to worry about breaking my bank or anything like that. So that was pretty awesome. And so after the first year of research, I came out of it, like with any good research project, I came out with way more questions than I had started with. So I decided I wanted to expand it into a thesis, and actually expand it to Eastern Canada as well. And not so much in terms of a comparative study between East and West, but looking for interesting common threads that I was able to make better informed statements about. So I got funded for another summer of research and went east and did another 13 festivals in Eastern Canada. And essentially what the thesis ended up looking at was different systems of value that are constructed within festival spaces, and not only how that value is created, but where you can find and what you can learn from moments of tension and conflict within those established systems of value. And when we think about festivals, we don't always think about tension and conflict because they're very much understood as spaces that are very open-minded, that are very accepting. It's sort of a crossroads where a lot of different groups and demographics can come together and work together and learn from each other. And that's very much like what the Festival Foundation is all about. But at the end of the day, when you're creating a place like that, a scene like that, and you're having people from so many different angles come and interact with the same space, the way that value is created is inevitably going to be really different. So like an example would be somebody who goes to a festival because they really like the party and it's a really fun social environment for them. But that's kind of what they go for, is for that side of the scene. And then somebody who attends a festival because of the artistic and the cultural merit that they feel is the most important thing to take away from that. And so not always, but sometimes there can be this intersection of those two different systems of value that can create a certain type of disjuncture and a certain type of discomfort, especially when it comes to defining things like community and common values and what it means to really sort of in practice carry out what the festival atmosphere represents in theory. So it was kind of looking at all of these different groups, performers, attendees, coordinators, looking at different groups and individuals within those groups and figuring out what they thought the main set of values were within that space and how those sets of values interacted with other systems of values within that space as well. So it was very, very interesting. It's very messy, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's a lot of things that feed into that dynamic. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting, very, very interesting study. I felt very fortunate to be able to learn those lessons in the way that I did. It was very hands-on. And that was definitely something that continued my projection into that world of festivals and events coordination, and kind of what's brought me to where I am today.
And that's as you were talking about the different value propositions and things, one of the things that my family builds our summer around, or plans our summer around, is to make sure we're in town for the Calgary Folk Music Festival. This is particularly since my daughter showed up 9 years ago, because as a value proposition now for a family, rather, I used to go to festivals for the music that, love the artists, go for the party for sure. But now I've shifted to be able to have a weekend where my kid can be way more free range in the city than they otherwise would be, and the sense of community that comes with that and everything. So it's interesting. And then there have been times where someone might be there for more of a party reason and the conflict that creates. And really that's an interesting parallel just about how cities operate in a lot of ways. The music festivals would be more curated than just the regular population of a city, but there's a lot of interesting parallels there. So how is that the learnings from your thesis, how has that impacted the work that you do today in terms of taking that over many years, looking at understanding how these festivals work and the kind of spaces and experiences that they create?
I think that it's informed. It's informed in so many ways that I don't think that I could even really right. I can't even imagine what it would be like doing the work I do now without having that foundation behind me. But I think it really comes down to a couple things. And one of them is being able to attend festivals, like folk roots and music festivals from Vancouver Island to Newfoundland, gave me the most incredible insight on the different ways that things can be done, and the different ways that this similar intention can be executed, and the collaborative efforts that it takes to really put these events together. I've said for as long as I've been doing this, that every festival is its own special little snowflake. And that's like, it sounds like really hilarious and cheesy, but it's incredible when you start getting into the inner workings of these events, and you see the difference in approach, and really, you know, for the most part, it's all coming at different angles, looking for the same outcome. So that has been a really interesting thing, just in terms of, when you work in this business, you have to be comfortable with the fact that it's not going to go as planned. There's always going to be things that you have to troubleshoot. You have to be incredibly flexible, and you have to kind of pick your battles on things that are going to become a big deal, and things that you're able to just sort of process as you move through the motions. But having this amazing lexicon of like this Rolodex of different ways that you can approach things, just from what I was able to see and encounter at these different festivals, I can't imagine doing what I do without that. And the other part of it, I think, is just, it gave me an incredible foundation to continue to want to learn about these events. And it just kind of made me realize that there isn't, I think by the time I finished my thesis, I was fairly exhausted by academia, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to fit something like, the world of festivals, particularly specific kinds of festivals that really grew out of the folk revival in the 60s. It became really hard to kind of just like fit that into the right shape of the academics wanted, and specifically kind of molding it around different theories. And it started to get pretty exhausting. And so the actual, like the final paragraph of my thesis, which is 93 pages long, it is like the longest undergrad thesis that has ever been written, because I just over researched to the nines, because it was such an amazing field to be researching in. But the final paragraph is kind of just like a mic drop. Like, I quote Paul Valery and just say, like, poems are never finished, only abandoned. And it's just sort of this thing where I'm like, I don't know what else I can say. And so pushing myself to that point where I kind of got to the point that moment where I was just like, all that was left to do was drop the mic. Once I kind of recovered from that, it just opened up all of these other areas of interest and of passion. And so it kind of is that thing of like, you sort of push yourself to the edge so that you can really learn what, when you come out the other side of it, what you still have left. And it turned out that I had a lot of initiative to keep doing what I was doing. So it really validated me in that way as well. I don't even know if I'm answering the question that you asked anymore. I just talked a whole bunch, and here we ended up.
No, absolutely. That's great. And a good sign of someone that's passionate and loves what they do.
Yeah, sure. Let's go with that.
So with all your experience with music festivals, what are some of the elements that are embodied in music festivals? And of course, as you explained, they're all extremely unique. But what are some of those elements of festivals that you think can be brought into cities to improve the everyday places where people live? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that even though every festival is so different, there's a lot of common threads that run through them. And I think that something that's really amazing and beautiful about the festival world, that I think is what continues to draw people to it, is the things that we really practice and celebrate within a festival site are kind of what we would like to see in our society in a bigger way. We're able to kind of create this little micro community where there is, like we were saying before, there's sort of this junction of many different people of different backgrounds from different scenes coming together and working together and learning from each other. There's an amazing element of trust, like you were talking about taking your daughter to Calgary Folk Fest and kind of feeling like she can have free reign, because there's sort of this community that is, it's a safe space. We feel like we've created this really beautiful safe space where people look after each other, and specifically, you feel like it's the kind of place where if a kid, falls and scrapes their knee, someone's going to pick them up and help them find mom and dad if mom and dad are, couple of steps away or whatever it may be. So I think that there's this really beautiful current of being very open-minded and accepting. And that's not unanimous. That doesn't mean that absolutely anyone could show up with any values and be accepted into that community. It's a certain kind of acceptance that is really contingent on acceptance, if that makes sense.
Yep,
like if you show up with that mindset to have open arms and to be part of something that is really dynamic and forgiving and giving and accepting and all of those things. So I think that what we see in festivals there's so many things that could be applied, and that we make a lot of efforts to apply in the general landscape of our cities, that are very complicated when you get them outside of the festival grounds and the festival dynamic. But I think that's part of the reason why they're so important, and part of the reason why they're so that they're really special to a lot of people, is because it is that place where you can kind of experience this funny little utopia or something.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's very playful as well. There's this idea that things don't need to be taken super seriously, and in that sense, it's a little bit, there's some escapism to that as well, where people are able to go and just suspend their constraints of everyday life and encounter things that they might never see. And it's a place to kind of open your eyes a little bit, or broaden your horizons, because you might not be into, Afrofusion funk, but you might encounter an Afrofusion funk band that just changes your life, and you never would have really encountered that in everyday life, but it allows you to sort of let your shoulders down and try something new. So I think all of those elements that the reason that we go to festivals and put so much value in those spaces, I think that that's something that we want to see more of in our society. And that's why it's so important that these spaces exist.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And I think that that's a really interesting insight in terms of the kinds of community, the kinds of experiences that we might not see or even think about in the day to day. So, makes me think that an experience, it could be musical, community, and otherwise, could be really, you can see what's possible in the maybe say, like you say, a safer space of a music festival, and then there could be some lessons, experiences, relationships that can transfer out into the broader community or broader city that a festival is in, to make some positive shifts in the local society. So that's really really encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the last question I have for you today is something that we ask all our guests. Can you tell me a city that you love and why you love it?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. There's a lot. I mean, I grew up in a very small town or living in really rural places. So there's something even still, I've been in Vancouver for the last 3.5 years. And there's something even still today that's very exciting and alive about being in a city. Just how much is happening, how much is available to you, how much is just alive at that moment. Cities never sleep. And I think that that's a really exciting thing. But I don't know. There's a lot of cities that are really amazing. Right now, I'm living in Vancouver, which is not it's not an easy place to live by any means. It's kind of the city right now that's getting a lot of heat in Canada for being inaccessible in terms of housing, and it's, you know, the property market is insane, and there's a lot of things about it that make it really difficult. But I really, really love living here for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that because it's difficult, it really it keeps you super honest in terms of what you're doing here. And it makes you sort of be accountable to yourself in the things that you do, because it's not the easiest place to live. You have to be able to the things that you do, you have to know that you're really in it. And so it's this, you don't even have an option but to be honest with yourself in terms of like why you're doing something, what you want to get out of it, and why you're passionate about it. And the amount that I have learned in Vancouver, I mean, it's a really interesting music scene to work in, partially because it's really difficult. It's called No Fun City because we still have liquor laws from the Prohibition. I mean, technically, unless you have a special liquor license, which is called a cabaret license, it's illegal to stand up and drink your beer in Vancouver.
Really? Nobody
really enforces that, but it is still a law. Yeah, it's just, and it's a really cutthroat music industry out here. It's very interesting, and it's not all super positive, but the amount that you have to learn to navigate those avenues to be able to still make arts and culture very accessible is it's the best crash course you could ever ask for. I could go to university for years, you know, doing music management, and I would learn some really amazing things, but I don't think that it would be as effective on the ground as the lessons that I've learned in the city. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, but I really, really love living in Vancouver for the reason that it keeps me super honest, and it's very much a challenge, which can be very frustrating, but also really exciting and very rewarding if you just, you know, take a deep breath and persevere. Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. I've never heard Vancouver or any place that, you know, is expensive or pricey or has other challenges to live that keeps you honest in terms of what the heck you're doing there. Because you can't get away with being lazy and, you know, rent's cheap or this is here. That's a really I think a really positive way to look at the realities of that city and cities like it. Yeah, that's a really good glass half full and constructive way of thinking about it.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, you caught me on a glass half full constructive kind of day.
Awesome.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for taking the time and giving us some insights on how the world of music can help us build better cities.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me today.
360 Degree City is created by our team at Intelligent Futures. To learn more about the work we do, head to intelligentfutures.ca. And if you have any feedback for the podcast, please email us at hello@360degree.city or ping us on any of our social media channels. If you'd like to give us feedback in person, you can find me, my family, and the rest of the Intelligent Futures team at the Calgary Folk Music Festival in a couple of weeks later in July. I'm John Lewis. Thanks for stopping by.